Welcome to the Eliot Society, where we are, pursuing truth and beauty. And hey, come on, guys, stop through and goodness through great literature. Okay, all right. What is this? Okay, come on. What is the? Okay, guys, listen. I know you're upset. Just stop throwing things. Okay. I know. I would be mad at me too. The previous video was 36 minutes. I got a little carried away, but guys, I'm telling you, you got to trust me on this. It's either I do a video like that for 36 minutes or I just divide it up into, two 18-minute videos. I mean, guys, I'm just telling you, this background stuff is important for the wasteland. I knew it. I mean, I came prepared. I've got a sock-proof vest on. I knew I was going to get things thrown at me. So here we are. Let's enough tomfoolery. Let's see what's going on over here in the world of my slides. Okay, so it is what it is. Here we are. This is video number 3 on The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. And let me see, introduction. Yeah, so we've done the poetry. You guys should have a real firm grasp on sort of the generalities. Poetry would be the historical and biographical context. My goodness, we covered medieval era, we covered Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, Romanticism, man is basically good, his progress is inevitable, optimism, wrecking ball, World War I, and after the wrecking ball of World War I, T.S. Eliot writes this, and he's attempting to capture the fragmentation, the brokenness, the angst, and all that would have been stirring in the psyche of someone living in the Western world in the 1920s, once again, right after the horrors of World War I. That's essentially what this poem is all about. So here we are. This is just review. What was the culture thinking about? Well, let's see. What had the culture been through? Christian worldview car goes through the tunnel, goes over 3 speed bumps, Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment. Enlightenment says reason or science is the way we gain truth. The pendulum swings a little bit in the 19th century. It's not swinging to a more biblical approach, but it's swinging to, well, I have feelings, and my feelings, my emotions are so important. And okay, so it's a little bit off the, sort of just reason and sort of cold, dead, calculating mind to heart and nature and emotion and intuition. But you remember that I told you this, the mantra, the 2 basic tenets of Romanticism, that man is basically good. Against what Scripture teaches, man is basically good, and he's only getting better and better. We have Darwinian evolution. We have Hegel's view of history here. I mean, Marx, class warfare, and then he picks up on I'm sorry, I'm getting into a lot of things here that I know we haven't studied, but in every discipline, Western man was saying, wow, we're just improving and getting better and better. And then, boom, World War I just wrecking ball smashes it all, because you can't look at the horrors of World War I and still conclude, wow, look at how amazing we are. You can't do that. So in that context, over there on the far right, 1922 is the publication year of this poem by T.S. Eliot. There you have it. And we talked about his life, born in 1888. He was actually born in St. Louis. He eventually renounces his American citizenship and becomes a British citizen. He writes The Wasteland in 1922, joins the Church of England in 1927, writes poetry for decades, 1945, writes the other, I think, poem that he's most famous for, called 4 Quartets. Very different perspective than The Wasteland, I'll tell you that. But anyway, let's get into it. I said we are eventually going to read this poem. This is the last introduction video, but I do want to brace you guys. This poem, I've been telling you, it's a dandy. And here goes. First of all, in this brief, well, I say brief poem, it's longer than a lot of poems, but it's still only a few pages long. There are over 60 allusions. What's an illusion? No, it's not a magic trick. Come on, guys. That's an illusion with an I. Allusion is when you're referring to or pointing to, hinting at another work of literature. 60. Okay, keep that in mind. So in other words, he's quoting, well, I will just say this. The entire poem, almost in its entirety, is made up of quotations from other authors who came before him. Almost entirely. This is a poem that's compiled by T.S. Eliot, but to say that he wrote it would be a little bit misleading. That's not what he intended to do. He's taking quotes and he's taking fragments from many, many, many authors, and he's kind of throwing them on the canvas, maybe a little bit like a Jackson Pollock painting. But we'll get to that later. To over 40 different writers. 40 different writers. Take this in. Oh boy. And here's the fun part. In 6 different languages, everything from Sanskrit, which he actually studied at Harvard. There's a little bit of French in there. There's some German, Latin, ancient Greek. So yeah, it helps. I'm going to help you out with some of the translations from all time periods. So what T.S. Eliot's doing is reaching back in history and in the literary tradition of, honestly, the West and the East, and he's pulling out all of these little fragments, these little tidbits, these little ideas, and organizing them and kind of throwing them on the canvas. I'll tell you why in just a little bit. I already said from east to west. When I say east and west, I hope you know what I mean by that. But if you don't, I mean, when I say the Western world, I'm talking about Europe and America primarily, to be honest with you. When I'm talking about the East, we're talking about China or India primarily. Okay, so we're talking hemispheres. That's what I mean by that. All right, and constant change on. This is what makes one of the things that makes The Wasteland a very difficult poem. These constant changes in the narrative voice. Friends, listen, in one line, it might be a woman talking to her friend at a bar. The next line might be a quotation from Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. The next line could be something in ancient Sanskrit that is supposedly what the Buddha said. I mean, it really is very difficult sometimes to sort of parse out who is saying what and who is speaking and to whom are they speaking. We're going to do that as best we can, but I'm going to prepare you ahead of time. You're not going to get all of that. That's not even the point. So hang with me. Now, we've talked about the different kinds of poetry, and I said that an epic poem, remember I said an epic is EPIC, an extremely long poem written about an incredible hero, about a culture. Now, there are a number of modernist, when I say modernist authors, I mean after World War I. There's not really modernist authors before World War I. World War I changed everything, who are attempting to write what they would call a modern epic. So they're not necessarily going to follow all the rules that Homer and Virgil followed, dactylic hexameter and so forth. But let me give me a second to kind of see the connections here that you could think about The Wasteland as a kind of epic. So we're gonna look at the epigraph a little bit later. So I'm not going to translate it and talk about it right now, but in that epigraph, the Sibyl of Cumae is speaking. Now, let's just do that right now. Okay, and then we can translate it later. In this image I have on the right-hand side of the screen, you may be familiar with the ancient Roman epic called the Aeneid. And in the Aeneid, Aeneas, the hero, he's the guy in the middle, has to go to the underworld because his father, who had just recently passed away, called him there. And when he gets there, his father wants to show him the glories of future Rome, what Rome is going to be. And it's this grand, climactic, and really beautiful moment in the poem. It's in book 6 out of 12 books. So it's kind of like, you know, the center point of the chiasm, you know, of the poem and so on. But anyway, the guy on the right, if you remember your ancient mythology, is Charon, the guy who, you know, kind of runs the whole ferry boat guy that has to get you across the river Styx to get you into the underworld. The lady on the left holding the golden branch, that's the Sibyl. Who was the Sibyl? She was a prophetess at the temple of Apollo. What was her job? If you had a really tough question, you go to the Sibyl. She would stand over a crack in the ground, and these weird gases would kind of flow up. This was how it was in Greece. And she would kind of become, I don't know, high or possessed by Apollo, and then Apollo would speak forth through her. That's how you'd get your answer to your question. She was also sort of the gatekeeper to the underworld. If you were going to go visit the underworld as a living person, not advisable, by the way, you'd have to go through the Sibyl. So she has this position of authority. There's this whole idea of life and death connected with her. And in the epigraph, she makes the first, I guess you could say it, that she has the first words. Before the poem even starts, there's this little preface, or we call it an epigraph. We're going to talk a little bit later about what she says, but I just want you to know that because T.S. Eliot invokes the Sibyl at the very, very, very beginning, he is connecting the poem, first of all, to Virgil. Hopefully you see how that happens, because Virgil's the author of the Aeneid, which connects the story to Dante. Now, how does that happen? I know, guys, and this is the whole thing about the Wasteland, is it's sort of like the culmination of all your years of studying the Western canon of literature. You kind of have to know your way around, you know, 2,000 years of history and literature. But in Dante's Inferno, Dante, who is going through the circles of the Inferno or hell, and then purgatory on his way to paradise, heaven, to see the beatific vision, his guide is Virgil. So Virgil's guide is the Sibyl, Dante's guide is Virgil. So you see how just by invoking the Sibyl at the beginning of the poem, T.S. Eliot is already sort of like a spider web. He's kind of making connections to the ancient Roman world, the medieval Italian world, and so forth. So in referencing these well-known epics of the past, what Eliot, I think, is probably doing here is he's connecting his voice, or these voices, or our voices, I'll explain later, to these other epics. And I think it was Dr. Nick Mount, professor at the University of Toronto, who called it an epic in 435 lines. So by invoking these other epics, it's sort of like, you know, Milton, you know, John Milton at the beginning of Paradise Lost, you know, he invokes Homer. And he basically says, yeah, Homer did this, again, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And he had his muse, I have the Holy Spirit, and here's what I'm going to do. I mean, he just elevates the game from the beginning. Like, whoa, you just put yourself on a level with Homer. And Eliot is invoking the same, in a similar way, big names from the past. Now, this is going to seem like a little bit of an aside, and I don't really know how much time I'm going to spend on it, But let me just throw it out there, and if we have time, we will. But T.S. Eliot himself said that one of the inspirations for The Wasteland from which he drew was a book that was published just a couple of years before The Wasteland, written by a guy named Jesse Weston, who wrote a book called From Ritual to Romance. So I just want you to be familiar with this book. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it's about. It's about the history of the Grail legend. You know the Grail legend. Come on, you've seen Indiana Jones. The Holy Grail, supposedly the cup from which Jesus drank at the Last Supper. What he is trying to establish in this book is that the legend of this object called the Holy Grail actually goes back before Christianity. The story that Christians have made of the Grail is just a continuation. That's his point in the book, of the same general kind of thing that predates Christianity by quite a bit. But he also connects the Grail legend to the legend of the Fisher King. If you're not familiar with the Fisher King myth, the idea is that the health of the land is connected to the health of the king. So the king's health can be restored if a knight goes on a quest. You see kind of the overlaps between a knight going on a quest, the Holy Grail, Fisher King. And so Eliot believed that beneath the broken streets of Europe, there is an old story. And so hopefully it'll become a little bit clear as we go along how all three of these might be connected. But since T.S. Eliot himself said, yes, this book From Ritual to Romance was very important to me as I wrote this poem, you need to be familiar with it. Now, let me blow your mind a little bit more with a few other things. First of all, here are some, not all, some of the authors that T.S. Eliot quotes in this poem: Chaucer, Virgil, Homer, Sophocles, Dante, Shakespeare, Spenser, Fairy Queen, the Bible, plenty of time, Huxley, Conrad, Joseph Conrad, Baudelaire, you're going to see that right in part one, Wagner, the German composer, Milton, Paradise Lost, Petronius, Ovid, ancient Roman poet, Walt Whitman, and, whoa, wait a second, where did this come from? The Upanishads, the Hindu scriptures, and so there's no limit really to time period, area of the world, language, no restrictions. Speaking of languages, what languages are we going to have to become familiar with to understand The Wasteland? Well, no big deal, guys. Just French, English, Italian, Greek, Latin, German, and oh yeah, brush up on your Sanskrit. Yeah, that's an ancient Babylonian language. So these numerous allusions, this is a quote from Dr. Nick Mount, who he was a professor at University of Toronto. I don't know if he's still there or not. Just want to give credit where credit's due. The numerous allusions in The Wasteland close down the poem to me. I mean, obviously, guys, some people start reading the poem and then they think, I can't do this. This is just, I don't even know who Petronius is. Okay, so they get discouraged. It's too difficult. But hey, time out. That's the point. So when you experience that, not if, when you experience that, realize that's what you're supposed to experience. That's the part of their function in the poem. The Wasteland in some ways is sort of a test. You know, if you get enough of the allusions in the poem, then you will, you'll get, I'm going to walk you through enough of them. Then you will share T.S. Eliot's despair because you know a little bit about their tradition, whose death he's lamenting. What Eliot is saying in this poem is that the tradition, the stream, if you want to call it that, the stream of history and philosophy and literature that has been flowing for thousands of years, and flows with the likes of Homer and Chaucer and Wagner and Huxley and Dante and the Bible and Whitman and so forth, that stream that has been flowing, that conversation that's been happening for thousands of years, is now, in a sense, dead. Ooh, yikes. That just got dark all of a sudden. Yeah, well, hang with me. That's why it's called the Wasteland. Okay. It's not called Disney World. Okay. Yeah. The name of the poem's not Disney World. It's the Wasteland. There's also a Celtic myth. Talk a little bit about the title. Celtic myth in which the land has become barren when the king marries a wicked woman. You know, the gods are doing all these things. The land can't become fruitful again if the hero can't do the right deeds. All right. Now, let's go back to the Grail, the Grail story. And I'm just kind of throwing out some of these fragments here. And when we walk through the poem, some of these things will make a little bit more sense. Again, I mentioned the Fisher King earlier. It's just a fisherman who becomes a king. All right. It doesn't have some other, symbolic meaning. He becomes ill as he's the keeper of the Grail in this old legend. And he's not supposed to take a wife. That's the Grail legend. He's supposed to remain pure and chaste. So the king becomes sick. And remember, when the king's health is connected to the health of the land, thus the wasteland. Okay, I hope that some of this is starting. This goes back to what Mount talks about as these old stories beneath the streets of Europe. So how do we tie all of this together? Seems a little bit, fragmented. Eliot uses this image and he connects it to man's sickness after World War I. Okay, it all goes back to what has happened to the Western tradition as a result of man's inhumanity to man, the death of Romanticism and so forth in World War I. That's why I spent all that time, doing all the background material. Now, let me explain what this is on this image on the right. You can, if you want to go to the underworld, apparently the way folks in the ancient world believed that you could actually go there. Remember, the Sibyl would have to take you, and right here's the passageway. Yeah, it's a place called Lake Avernus in central Italy. You go there, there's a certain entrance, and the Sibyl would guide you right down into the underworld. Charon will get you across the river Styx. You give Cerberus, the three-headed monster dog, a little drugged sop of bread, and then you'll drug him. He'll go to sleep, and then you can go do your business in the underworld. So anyway, that's why I have that picture up. Let's take a look at the epigraph. All right, open that up. If you have the same version that I have, the epigraph is actually on page 3. If you happen to have this Norton version. It's very misleading. When you look at this book, it looks like, whoa, that's 200 or 300 pages. Yeah, it's all just articles and commentary. The actual poem is only a few pages long. So guarding the entrance to the wasteland, as I said earlier, is the Sibyl. Now, let's read the epigraph. And I'm not going to go beyond the epigraph. And we'll get into the poem in the next video. But pardon, my rough Latin and Greek. Nam sibulam quidem cumis ego ipse, oculis meis vidi in ampulla pendere, et cum illi pueri dicerent, Sibula, titheleis, respondebat illa apothanein thelo. Yeah, and then remember I told you the poem was dedicated to another poet and friend of T.S. Eliot named Ezra Pound, but let's just translate that really quickly. A good translation here, weedy. You got to go all the way to weedy. Come on, I know some of you are Latin scholars. Weedy. There you go, past tense of to see. So I saw ego ipse oculis, with my own eyes, nam sibulam quidem cumis, the Cumaean Sibyl. So I saw with my own, I'll tell you what this comes from later, but let's just translate it. I saw with my own eyes the Cumaean prophetess or Sibyl in a jar, in ampulla, pendere, hanging. Et cum illi pueri dicerent. And the boys asked her, pueri, from puer for boys, you know that, asked her, Sibula tithales. Now it changes to Greek. Okay, those letters are Greek letters. Sibyl, what do you want? And she responded, respondaba illa apothenane thelo. Thelo, I wish, apothenane, to die. Now, so the Sibyl, who can see the future, okay, she can see what's in the wasteland, because this is we're kind of at the gate here. We're at the entrance to the wasteland, right? We're at the epigraph. So what do you want? So the Sibyl who can look in it and see, she says, I want to die. That should scare us all quite a bit, because we're all getting ready to go into the wasteland. We're getting ready to tackle this poem. But we have a warning from the beginning that the Sibyl who can see what it is says, yeah, I just want to die. Now, what is this from? This is from a first century fragment manuscript called the Satyricon. The Satyricon. And I think that Eliot chose a fragment for a reason, because an overarching theme of this entire poem is going to be fragmentation. The Western world is fragmented, disjointed, and just messed up because of the impact of World War I. The other thing here, why is she in a jar hanging upside down? So the Sibyl asked, the gods asked the Sibyl what she wanted, and she said, oh, I want eternal life. The problem is she didn't ask to be eternally young. So she just aged and aged and aged and aged and aged. Imagine being 897 years old. So anyway, what do you want? Well, I can look into the future, and I can tell you that what I want to do is die. Now, let me just take a look and see if there's anything else. Okay. Yeah. I think I already covered what's on this slide, guys. So just bear with me for a moment. Why is this? Yeah, think about it. It was published, 1922, just a few years after World War I. The general mood, despair, disillusionment, confusion. Eliot's trying to capture that, of course. Oh yeah, I do remember this. I've been mentioning Nick Mount. Well, I've got a couple of quotes from Dr. Mount, which I thought are really helpful. He did some videos on all kinds of different literary issues and authors, and one of them was Eliot. He said, what Eliot is saying with these allusions in the poem is that if you can read this line and you know what it is, then you feel what I feel. That this past I'm evoking is now in fragments. And then I think I already mentioned this one. The difficulty of illusions is their function. If you get them, then you share his despair. Okay, before I end this video, I hope I got this one shorter than 36 minutes, although I don't really clock them when I'm doing them. Last little thing, the poem is made up of 5 sections. They're all highly significant. The titles are highly significant. All I'm going to do now is show you the titles. The first section is called Burial of the Dead. Like I said, guys, this is not Disney World. Okay. Yeah, the Burial of the Dead. Section 2 is called A Game of Chess. Section 3, a reference to the Buddha, the Fire Sermon. We'll learn a little bit about Buddhism when we get to that one. Death by Water. And then finally, we'll talk about some Hindu references and other things when we get to What the Thunder Said. Okay, I hope this video, along with the poetry video, the biographical historical background material. Now I kind of sort of hope and think and pray that we are ready. Look at that. The next video, we're actually going to get into the poem itself. Oh, some of you are thinking, you just really think you're hilarious, don't you? Well, hey, look, you know what? I endured the tossing of the socks at the beginning of the, I haven't forgotten about this. Okay. Taking names. See you in the next video. Go ahead and read part 1, Burial of the Dead, and we'll talk about it in the next video. See you then, guys.